Hello guys, I'm here to do a quick lecture on concurrent estates for real property. This is for the California bar exam, and this is based on what they want you to know based on the MBE outline that they give out on their website. So I will be going over concurrent estates as an approach, and this is good for essays and MBEs because as we've seen, I've done lots of real property MBEs, and basically they are essays, so you have to break them down kind of like an essay, so it goes hand in hand. So let's start with joint tenancy. Now, a joint tenancy is a conveyance. Let me get my pointer out here. Joint tenancy is a conveyance of real property of two or more people that is distinguished by a right of survivorship. Very important, right of survivorship. Now, right of survivorship is when you have tenant 1 and tenant 2, and both of them have a 50-50 interest in the property. And right of survivorship means if one of them dies, then the tenant 1 dies, then tenant 2 has the right to take over tenant 1's right of survivorship there. So it'll be 100% property interest in him. Okay. Thus, joint tenants cannot pass their property interest by will or intestate succession. There we go. So JT, they cannot pass their property by will, not going to work, or intestate succession. At death, their property interest automatically passes to the other joint tenants. That's very important. No will, no intestate succession. Okay. And it automatically passes to the other JT. To create a joint tenancy, the grantor must clearly express his intent to create a joint tenancy by using the survivorship language. And additionally, the 4 unities must be in place to create a joint tenancy. So in order to do a joint tenancy, you need the 4 unities, and the 4 unities are right here. And I like to remember them as PIT. Oops, here we go. Sorry. P-I-T-T, PIT. That stands for possession, interest, time, and title. You can go over those, but those need to be addressed in your essay. Okay, and then we go on to other considerations to consider for a joint tenancy. Severance, partition, sale, and mortgage. Now, a joint tenancy is severed, and what I mean by severed, it's destroyed if you have a partition, a sale, or a mortgage. Now, the mortgage I'll go over in a second is based on a title theory or lien theory if it's severed or not. But for now, let's talk about partition and a sale. So joint tenancies can be severed by partition, sale, or mortgage. Now, a JT is made of more than one, of course, JT1 and JT2, let's just say. So now JT1 decides to go and sell his part of his interest in the property. He decides to sell it. Once he sells it, that JT right of survivorship is destroyed. So JT2 does not have an undivided interest in the whole property at this point. Now that the joint tenancy is severed, it means it's destroyed, and now turns into a tenant in common, a TIC. And we'll go over tenant in common below. But remember, once it's severed by a partition, sale, or mortgage, it is severed, the JT is destroyed, and now becomes a tenant in common. And tenants in common have different elements that need to be met. So if it's partitioned, it's considered a severance. If there's a sale on any part, it's considered a severance under the doctrine of equitable conversion. So equitable conversion, if you guys know what that is, that's when a seller and buyer basically come into an agreement, and once the agreement is signed, the seller is no longer valid on this. It's now the buyer's property. So according to equitable conversion, it converts over to the buyer at this point. Okay, and that goes into if it's destroyed and all of that too, but that's for later. So equitable conversion, now it's in the buyer's hands, which now ends the joint tenancy. Okay, so even if the sale hasn't gone through yet, so it's just the fact that they signed that agreement, now it's in the buyer's hands, now the joint tenancy is destroyed, now tenant 2 does not have right of survivorship, or tenant 1 does not have right of survivorship. It's destroyed, it's gone, it turns into a TIC now, tenant in common with the new person. Now, if it's a mortgage, it's severed if it is a title theory mortgage, title theory state. If it's a title theory state, the mortgage severs the joint tenancy. It is now a tenant in common. If it's a lien theory state, it does not sever the joint tenancy. It does not turn into a tenant in common. No, nothing. So then what we have to do after that is the joint tenancy is severed by the mortgage. So joint tenancy rules, creation of the 4 unities. And the other considerations, if applicable, are here: the severance, partition, sale, and mortgage. Now, the other considerations are very, very big issues when it comes to MBEs. You have to know if it's severed or if it's not. It's very important. Does it turn into a TIC or does it not? Does it stay a JT? Very important. Okay, and if you have severance, you discuss that inside of your essay. And then you go to the rights and duties, which are below. So let's talk about our next one before we get to rights and duties. Concurrent estate. Our next concurrent estate is a tenancy by the entirety. Now, this is a marital interest in the property with the right of survivorship. So you guys can go through that, what's the creation and all of that, but this is very little on MBEs. I've only seen it maybe once or twice, and on an essay, not very many times, maybe once or twice too. Then we'll go into the tenants in common. Now, this is what I was talking about. When the joint tenancy is destroyed, it becomes a tenancy in common. Now, the rule for this, a tenancy in common, is the default estate created by a conveyance of real property to two or more people. The grantor need not use any type of explicit language to create a tenancy in common. For example, up here on the JT, they must use the explicit right of survivorship language. Down here, there is no explicit language. It can just be from O to A and B. That makes it a straight tenancy in common, and we know we're working with the tenancy in common on MBE or essays. We don't have to write the right of survivorship, okay? Let's not get confused about that. Now, tenancy in common, each tenant in common has a separate but undivided interest in the property. Belongs to them. Can't divide it. It's an undivided interest. The right to possess and enjoy the entire property. Now, that gets big on MBEs. Is tenant one, there's tenant one and tenant two. Tenant one is enjoying the property and tells tenant two they can't. That becomes an issue when it comes over to the tenant's rights and duties here. And the right to transfer their interest in the property freely during their lifetime or at death. So a TIC, they can transfer freely during their lifetime or at death, and there's no right of survivorship. Whereas up here, difference of the joint tenancy, it says here, oh, where are we at here? Joint tenants cannot pass their property interest by will or intestate succession. Okay, a little different there. You have to remember those two nuances there. Now, tenancy in common, you go over the rule, and then we go down to rights and duties. Okay, so these are the rights and duties of the tenant. Tenant rights and duties. These rights and duties apply to all landlord-tenant relationships also. So we have possession, adverse possession, rent from co-tenant, rent from third parties, carrying cost, repairs, improvements, and waste, partition, death, or mortgage, which we talked about earlier. So all of these things might come into and play an essay or an MBE, and you have to know, is co-tenant one liable for, let's say, repairs to co-tenant two? Co-tenant one, what portion of the carrying cost do they carry? Do they carry to tenant two? Now, if tenant two, does tenant two get to right to reimbursement or not? So those all have different rules. So possession, co-tenants may not exclude other co-tenants from any part of the property. I talked about this earlier. Tenant one, tenant two. Tenant two says, nope, can't come on the property. That means it's called ouster. You must address that in your essay. An ouster means they ousted them from the property, thus it's not lawfully done, okay? They both have rights to the property. Adverse possession, of course. Adverse possession is the most important thing for adverse possession is the statutory period. And we use HOAC for this. It must be hostile, open, and notorious, actual, and continuous, okay? You guys can go through that. Now that becomes a big portion of the essay on its own, so that's quite important there. Now rent from co-tenant and exclusive possession. Absent the ouster, a co-tenant and exclusive possession is not liable to the others for rent. Rent from third parties, let's say T1 and T2, and T1 decides to rent to a third party. Leasing a part of all the premises to a third party does not absolve a co-tenant from his or her duty to provide the other co-tenants a fair share of the rent. Tenant 1 needs to give tenant 2 its fair share of the rent. If not, tenant 2 can take it into court and sue for his portion of that rent. Carrying cost. Carrying costs include taxes, mortgage, and interest payments. Now here, this is important. Each co-tenant is responsible for their fair share of the carrying cost based on their undivided share. So both are responsible. This comes out a lot in MBE. So if you go over your MBEs and you get it wrong, write down the main elements of carrying cost. Repairs, co-teams may seek contribution for repairs that are reasonable or necessary. They need to be reasonable or necessary. If the other co-teams were given notice of the repairs, comes on all the time in MBEs. They weren't given notice of the repairs, but they want their contribution. They want their contribution from the other tenant. Can't happen. You need to give them notice first of what they're doing. Is it reasonable? Is it necessary? Improvements. Co-teams have no right to contribution for improvements. None. Zero. Waste. Co-tenants cannot commit waste. Voluntary, permissive, or ameliorative waste. And other co-tenants may bring an action for waste during the co-tenancy. No waste. Partition. They can bring an action for partition by voluntary agreement or court action. Death or mortgage. When the JT dies, the interest is distinguished at moment of death. It's distinguished at moment of death. It's gone. Another JTs become sole owner of the entire property. cannot pass this to heirs, devisees, or mortgages, or judgment lien creditors. Very important there too. So that's how we would write up our concurrent estates approach for JT. Tenancy by entirety, tenancy in common, tenants' right and duties. So that's just a quick overflow. This helps you with MBEs and essays. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I try to do it as quick as possible because most of the stuff we're supposed to have in our heads, which sometimes is impossible. But if we sit here and review this over and over, it sticks in your head, and you do lots of MBEs and you write your essays, because an MBE is essentially an essay if you really look at them. They go side by side. So good luck on the California Bar Exam. And my next video will be on real covenant essay approaches. Okay. Thank you. Take care.